19-year-old boy stands alone on a burning tank destroyer, flames licking at his boots, while 250 German soldiers and 6 armored vehicles close in from 3 sides. He weighs less than most high school quarterbacks. He should be dead. But for the next hour, he will become something the enemy cannot explain. A ghost made of gunfire and fury, a nightmare that refuses to die. This is not Hollywood. This is January 26, 1945, and this is the day Audie Murphy became immortal. The snow fell in silence across the Alsatian fields outside Holtzwihr, France, coating the frozen earth in a clean white shroud that seemed to mock the ugliness beneath it. It was the kind of January morning that made men's breath freeze in their lungs and turned rifle bolts sluggish with cold. The temperature hovered just below 0 Celsius, and the wind cut through wool and canvas like it had a personal grudge against anything warm-blooded. In the tree line south of the village, what remained of Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, waited in positions that felt more like graves than foxholes. 18 men. That's what was left of a company that had numbered 120 just 48 hours earlier. 18 hollow-eyed, frost-bitten survivors of the meat grinder called the Badavier woods, where the pines had been so thick with German gunfire that the bark had peeled away in strips and the snow had turned crimson in patches no one wanted to remember. They'd fought for every meter of that cursed forest, trading lives for frozen dirt that meant nothing except that it wasn't in German hands anymore. The casualties had been horrific. Men they'd shared cigarettes with on the transport ships, boys who'd written letters home about apple pie and pretty girls, now wrapped in shelter halves and stacked like cordwood waiting for graves registration to do its grim accounting. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy stood among them, though among wasn't quite accurate. At just over 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighing barely 110 pounds soaking wet, he looked more like someone's kid brother who'd stolen a uniform than the commander of this shattered remnant. His face was pale and sharp-featured, with eyes that had seen too much and a jawline that still hadn't quite lost its boyish softness. The uniform hung on him like it was borrowed. The helmet looked oversized on his narrow skull. But when he spoke, men twice his size shut up and listened, because something in those eyes told them this undersized Texan had walked through more fire than most of them would ever see. He was 19 years old. Behind him, in the command post they'd scraped out of the frozen earth, the field telephone crackled with static and bad news. Forward observers had spotted movement in the northern tree line, German infantry massing in the woods beyond the open fields. Armor 2. The distinctive rumble of diesel engines and the metallic squeal of tank treads carried across the snow even through the wind. 6 vehicles, maybe more. Panzers or Stooges, it didn't matter much which when you were sitting in a hole with nothing but rifles and a couple of bazookas that might or might not work in this cold. Murphy called for artillery coordinates, his voice steady and flat, stating grid references like he was ordering breakfast. The artillery officer on the other end confirmed the request. Rounds would be available, but the batteries were supporting 3 different positions and ammunition was tight. Translation: don't count on sustained fire. Translation: you're mostly on your own. He hung up the receiver and looked at his men. They stared back with the exhausted resignation of people who'd already used up their allotment of fear and were running on fumes of stubbornness and duty. Sergeant Ralph Weber sat against the frozen wall of the foxhole, his hands wrapped around a canteen cup of something that might have been coffee, but smelled more like scorched dirt. Private First Class Laddie Tipton checked his M1 Garand for the 100th time, fingers clumsy in wool glove liners that were more holes than fabric. They all knew what was coming. The Germans were going to try to break through here, push south toward the Colmar pocket, and there wasn't enough of Company B left to stop them. They'll hit us within the hour, Murphy said quietly. His Texas drawl had been sanded down by months of combat but still carried through in the vowels, a reminder that this officer giving orders had grown up dirt poor in Hunt County, hunting squirrels with a borrowed .22 to keep his siblings from starving. When they do, I want artillery on them fast and accurate. I'll call it in from up forward where I can see the whole field. Weber looked up. Sir, you'll be exposed out there. That's the idea, Murphy replied. I need to see what's coming or we'll waste every round. It was tactically sound and personally insane, but that was Murphy's style. He'd earned 3 silver stars, 2 bronze stars, and the Distinguished Service Cross before his 20th birthday by doing things that should have gotten him killed but somehow never did. Some of the men whispered that he was blessed. Others said he was cursed. Murphy himself never said much about it, just kept moving forward like a man with a debt to pay to the universe and not enough time left to settle it. The German attack began at 1,400 hours with the kind of methodical precision that made Wehrmacht operations so terrifying to face. First came the artillery, not much, just enough to announce their intentions. High explosive rounds whistled in and detonated in the tree line, throwing up geysers of frozen earth and splintered wood. Then the mortars, walking across the field in a pattern designed to suppress any defensive positions in the open. And finally, through the snow and smoke, the armor appeared. 6 tanks materialized out of the northern woods like prehistoric beasts slouching toward prey. They were a mix, Panzer IVs with their long-barreled 75mm guns and at least one Panther, its sloped armor painted in winter camouflage of white and dark green that made it blend with the forest edge until it moved. Behind them, spread out in a skirmish line that looked endless, came the infantry. 250 men, maybe more, in field-gray greatcoats and winter smocks, carrying Mausers and MP-40s, moving with the confidence of soldiers who knew they had numbers and firepower on their side. Murphy watched them come from his forward position near an abandoned M10 tank destroyer that sat 30 yards ahead of the main tree line. The M10 belonged to the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion and had been knocked out earlier in the day. A direct hit to the engine compartment had set it ablaze, and the crew had bailed out, leaving the burning hulk where it sat. The fire had mostly died down, but the wreck still smoldered, sending up thin ribbons of oily smoke that smelled of diesel fuel and scorched metal. Its turret was traversed to the side, the long 76mm gun pointing uselessly at the sky. But mounted on the turret ring was something still functional. A Browning M2 HB.50 caliber heavy machine gun, the kind of weapon that could put down anything short of a tank if you knew how to use it. Murphy had the field telephone with him, the wire snaking back through the snow to the command post. He crouched behind a small rise in the ground, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching the German formation advance. They were taking their time, confident, probably assuming the Americans had already pulled back after the pounding the 3rd Division had taken in the Badavier woods. Why would anyone be stupid enough to hold this position with so few men? He picked up the telephone handset. Fire mission. Grid 296435. Infantry in the open, approximately 250 strong. 6 armored vehicles bearing 280. Request immediate fire. The response came back within seconds. Roger. Rounds out in 3 minutes. 3 minutes was an eternity when tanks were rolling toward you. Murphy turned and shouted back toward the tree line. Fall back. Everyone back to the secondary line. Go now. His men didn't need to be told twice. They grabbed what they could and scrambled rearward through the snow, heading for positions another 100 yards back where there was at least some cover. They expected Murphy to follow. He didn't. He stayed where he was, watching the Germans close the distance, waiting for the artillery. The first round screamed in like freight trains derailing in midair and impacted right in the middle of the German formation. High explosive shells detonated with flat, brutal cracks that sent columns of snow and dirt skyward. Murphy adjusted fire, walking the barrage north and west, trying to catch the infantry as they spread out. Men fell. Others dove for cover. But there were too many of them, and they kept coming, flowing around the explosions like water around stones. The tanks didn't even slow down. Their engines roared and their treads churned through the snow, crushing frozen earth beneath steel links. The lead Panzer IV fired, and a 75mm shell shrieked past Murphy's position, close enough that he felt the displacement of air like a physical slap. It impacted somewhere behind him with a thunderclap boom. He needed better positioning. He needed to see more, direct fire more precisely. And he needed to do something about those tanks. That's when Murphy made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He stood up, sprinted across 30 yards of open ground while bullets kicked up snow around his boots, and clambered onto the burning M10 tank destroyer. The heat hit him first, waves of it radiating from the engine compartment where metal glowed cherry red beneath twisted armor plating. The whole vehicle stank of burning oil and melted rubber, and somewhere deep in its guts, the ammunition might still be cooking off. 76mm shells stored in the hull could explode at any second, turning the M10 into a steel bomb that would vaporize anything within 50 feet. Murphy ignored this. He swung himself up onto the deck, boots slipping on ice-slicked metal, and grabbed the spade grips of the .50 caliber machine gun. The German infantry were maybe 400 yards out now and closing. They'd seen him. Of course they'd seen him. He was standing on top of a burning vehicle in the middle of an empty field like a target in a shooting gallery. Rifle fire snapped past his head. Machine gun bursts from the advancing line chewed into the snow around the M10. A bullet struck the turret with a metallic ping that rang in his ears. Murphy racked the charging handle of the Browning, chambered around, and opened fire. The M2HB was a weapon designed for one purpose: destroying things. It fired .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds at a rate of 450 to 600 rounds per minute, each bullet weighing over an ounce and traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. When those rounds hit human beings, they didn't wound, they obliterated. Murphy swung the gun across the advancing German line and held down the butterfly trigger, and the Browning roared to life with a sound like the world's largest zipper being ripped open. The first burst caught a squad of infantry in the open. Men went down like puppets with cut strings, their bodies jerking and spinning as the massive bullets tore through winter coats and flesh and bone. Murphy adjusted his aim, sweeping the gun left, tracking another group that was trying to flank. The tracers drew bright lines through the falling snow, and where they touched, men died. He fired in controlled bursts, 5, 7 rounds at a time, conserving ammunition but keeping up a relentless stream of fire that hammered into the German formation like the fist of an angry god. A Panzer IV turned its turret toward him. Murphy saw it happening, saw the long gun barrel swinging in his direction, and knew he had maybe 2 seconds before 75mm high-explosive death arrived. He didn't move. He shifted fire to the infantry around the tank, cutting down the soldiers who were supposed to be supporting it, forcing them to scatter or die. The tank fired. The shell missed by 20 feet, impacting behind the M10 with a concussion that made the whole vehicle shudder beneath Murphy's boots. He kept firing. The Germans couldn't understand it. Their officers had to be screaming into radios, trying to explain how one man on a burning tank destroyer was holding up an entire assault. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. Here was a lone American, impossibly exposed, impossibly persistent, killing their comrades with mechanical precision while standing on a vehicle that might explode at any moment. It was irrational. It was terrifying. It was breaking their momentum. Murphy's field telephone rang. He let go of the gun with one hand, grabbed the handset, and shouted coordinates for another fire mission without taking his eyes off the advancing Germans. Artillery rounds rained down, adding to the chaos. He directed the barrage with the calm precision of someone calling in a poker bet, adjusting fire 30 yards north, walking it east to catch a group bunching up near a small rise. Between bursts on the .50 cal, he was functioning as his own forward observer, calling in fires that turned the snowy field into a landscape of smoke and shrapnel. The German infantry were closing now despite their losses. 300 yards. 250. Murphy could see their faces, pale ovals beneath helmets, mouths open, probably shouting orders he couldn't hear over the hammering of the Browning. He fired into them, methodical and relentless, swinging the gun barrel in controlled arcs. The barrel was glowing now, so hot it shimmered in the cold air. His hands burned even through his gloves where they gripped the spade handles. Spent shell casings piled up around his feet, clinking against the metal deck of the M10. A German MG-42 team set up in the open and opened fire, trying to suppress him. The 42 was faster than his Browning, a buzzsaw that fired 1,200 rounds per minute and sounded like canvas tearing. Bullets pinged off the M10's armor, walking up the hull toward Murphy's position. He didn't flinch. He traversed the .50 cal, found the MG-42 team, and put a 5-round burst directly into them. The machine gun went silent. Then the Panzers got smart. 2 Panzer IVs separated from the main group and began flanking left and right, trying to get angles on Murphy from different directions. If they coordinated their fire, he was finished. No amount of luck could dodge 75mm shells from multiple vectors. But coordination took time, and Murphy had learned in North Africa and Italy that time on a battlefield was a currency you could steal if you were fast enough and vicious enough. He concentrated fire on the infantry supporting the left-hand tank, cutting them down in clusters, forcing them to go to ground. Without infantry support, the Panzer was vulnerable, blind to its surroundings. The tank commander knew it too. The vehicle stopped, buttoned up, turret swiveling uncertainly. Murphy shifted to the right-hand tank's infantry screen and did the same thing, scything through soldiers who'd thought they were safely in support positions. The German attack was stalling. Officers were getting killed. Non-coms were getting killed. Soldiers were diving into shell craters and staying there because crossing open ground toward that damned burning tank destroyer had become suicide. The momentum that had carried them out of the tree line was bleeding away into the snow, turning it red in patches that steamed in the cold air. Murphy reloaded. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory from hundreds of hours on ranges and in combat. Pull the empty belt out. Load the new belt into the feed tray. Rack the charging handle. The whole process took maybe 15 seconds, but it felt like an eternity while German riflemen took potshots at him. A bullet creased his helmet with a sound like a hammer on steel. Another punched through the collar of his field jacket, so close to his neck he felt the heat of it. He got the gun back in action and kept firing. Time became strange. He didn't know if he'd been on that burning tank destroyer for 10 minutes or an hour. The world shrank to the field of fire in front of him, the recoil of the gun slamming into his shoulders, the brass casings spilling around his boots, the telephone handset that kept ringing with artillery officers asking for adjustments. He called in fires between bursts. He killed Germans. He survived. The M10 beneath him was an oven now, the metal so hot it burned through his boot soles. But he didn't move. Couldn't move. If he climbed down, the German attack would resume with full force and his 18 men wouldn't stand a chance. So he stayed and fought alone. The German infantry made one more push, trying to overwhelm him through sheer numbers. They came in a rush, winter-white figures against white snow, screaming to keep their courage up. Murphy met them with continuous fire, the Browning hammering out death at 500 rounds per minute. He swept the gun left to right and back again, burning through ammunition belts so fast the barrel turned white-hot. Men fell in rows. The snow in front of the M10 was churned and bloody, cratered with shell holes and littered with bodies in field gray. Then the shrapnel hit him. He didn't see where it came from. Maybe a mortar round, maybe a tank shell that burst against the frozen ground. He just felt the impact, sharp and hot, punching into his right leg like someone had jabbed him with a red-hot poker. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a white-hot spike that shot up from his calf to his hip. His leg buckled. He grabbed the gun mount to keep from falling. Teeth gritted so hard his jaw ached. Blood soaked through his trouser leg, warm against the cold air. He could feel it running down into his boot, pooling around his toes. The wound was bad, not immediately fatal, but bad enough that he should have been heading for an aid station. Instead, Murphy shifted his weight to his good leg and kept firing. The Germans were close now. 100 yards. 75. He could see individual faces, expressions twisted with fear and determination. Officers with pistols drawn, waving men forward. Grenadiers with stick grenades. Riflemen stopping to aim and fire. Bullets clanged against the M10's armor like hail on a tin roof. Murphy ignored them. He traversed the Browning, found targets, squeezed the trigger. The gun barked. Men died. His ammunition belt ran dry with a mechanical click that sounded impossibly loud. Murphy looked down at the feed tray. Empty. He glanced at the ammunition storage box. Also empty. He'd fired every round the M10 had left. For the first time in over an hour, the battlefield was quiet except for the distant rumble of artillery and the screams of wounded men. Murphy stood on the burning tank destroyer, blood running down his leg, hands blistered beneath his gloves, ears ringing from the endless hammering of the .50 cal. In front of him, the German attack had broken. Bodies lay scattered across 300 yards of snow. The Panzers had pulled back to the tree line, their infantry screens shredded. The soldiers who were still alive were retreating or huddling in shell craters, unwilling to advance another step toward the American lunatic on the burning tank. Murphy picked up the field telephone one last time. His voice was hoarse from shouting over the gunfire, but it was still steady. Fire mission. Enemy retreating north along axis 280. Request barrage on grid 296517. The artillery officer confirmed. 30 seconds later, high explosive rounds began falling on the retreating Germans, turning their withdrawal into a rout. Only then did Murphy climb down from the M10. His right leg gave out the moment his boots hit the ground, and he went down hard, face first into the snow. The cold felt good against his burning face. For a moment he just lay there, breathing in ragged gasps, tasting blood and diesel fumes and frozen earth. Then he pushed himself up on his hands and knees, got his good leg under him, and started crawling toward the tree line. He made it maybe 20 yards before Sergeant Weber and two other men reached him. They grabbed him under the arms and hauled him back toward the American lines, Murphy's wounded leg dragging a red line through the snow behind them. He tried to tell them he was fine, that they needed to get back to their positions in case the Germans attacked again. But the words came out slurred and stupid-sounding. Shock was setting in, the adrenaline finally draining away and leaving nothing but pain and exhaustion. They got him to the command post and laid him on a stretcher. A medic cut away his trouser leg, exposing the shrapnel wound, an ugly puncture in his right calf that was bleeding steadily but hadn't hit the artery. Lucky! Everything about this day had been lucky in the most insane way possible. The medic cleaned the wound, sprinkled it with sulfa powder, and wrapped it in gauze while Murphy stared at the roof of the dugout and tried to remember how to breathe normally. "Sir," Weber said, his voice rough with something that might have been awe or might have been horror. "You just held off an entire German company, by yourself, on a burning tank." Murphy closed his eyes. "I was calling artillery. That's all." "That's not all," Weber replied quietly. "That's not even close to all." The company held their position through the rest of the day and into the night. The Germans didn't come back. Reconnaissance later estimated that Murphy had killed or wounded somewhere between 50 and 80 enemy soldiers during his stand on the M10. The exact number didn't matter. What mattered was that Company B, 18 men and 1 lieutenant, had stopped an assault by 6 tanks and 250 infantry, and they'd done it because one undersized Texan had decided not to retreat. The following morning, Murphy's battalion commander came to see him in the aid station. He stood at the foot of Murphy's cot, looking at the pale, drawn face of the 19-year-old officer who'd somehow survived doing something that should have been impossible. "I'm recommending you for the Medal of Honor," the colonel said. Murphy nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. Do you understand what that means?" "I think so, sir." The colonel was silent for a moment. "You should have died on that tank destroyer." "Yes, sir," Murphy agreed. "I probably should have. Why didn't you pull back with your men?" Murphy thought about it, trying to find words for something he didn't fully understand himself. "Because if I did, sir, they'd all be dead. And I couldn't let that happen." The recommendation went through. On June 2, 1945, 4 months after Holtzwihr, 2nd Lieutenant Audie Murphy received the Medal of Honor from Major General John E. Dahlquist in a ceremony in France. By that time, he'd also been promoted to first lieutenant and then captain, becoming one of the youngest company commanders in the U.S. Army. He was 20 years old, but the war had already taken its toll in ways that medals couldn't fix. Murphy returned home to Texas in 1945 as the most decorated American combat soldier of World War II, 28 decorations from the United States and France, including every Valor Award the U.S. Army could bestow. He was on the cover of Life magazine. Hollywood came calling. He starred in 44 films, including playing himself in the 1955 adaptation of his memoir, To Hell and Back, which became Universal Pictures' highest-grossing film for 20 years. On screen, Murphy made his stand at Holtzwihr look almost easy, a heroic tableau of American courage and determination. The cameras couldn't capture what it had really been like. The heat from the burning tank scorching his lungs with every breath, the certainty of death that should have come but didn't, the weight of knowing that 18 men's lives depended on whether he could keep his hands steady on a machine gun while German bullets pinged off metal inches from his head. Off-screen, Murphy struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in the 1950s they just called it battle fatigue and expected men to tough it out. He slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow. He couldn't hold down relationships. He woke up screaming from nightmares that put him back in the Badavier woods or on that burning M10, fighting battles that had ended years ago but had never really stopped. He spoke publicly about these struggles, becoming one of the first major public figures to acknowledge that combat left scars deeper than shrapnel wounds. He advocated for better treatment for veterans suffering from what we now call PTSD, using his fame to draw attention to issues that most of America wanted to forget in the prosperous years after the war. Murphy died on May 28, 1971, at the age of 46, when the private plane he was traveling in crashed into Brush Mountain near Catawba, Virginia. The weather was terrible, heavy rain, dense fog, conditions that should have grounded any aircraft. The plane flew into the side of the mountain at cruising speed, killing everyone aboard instantly. Even in death, Murphy couldn't escape violent endings. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His grave is the second most visited site in the cemetery after President Kennedy's, a testament to how deeply his story resonated with Americans who understood that real heroism wasn't about being fearless. It was about being terrified and doing the job anyway. The stand at Holtzwihr became legendary not because it was unique in its courage, thousands of soldiers did brave things during World War II, but because it was so utterly stark in its impossibility. One man, one machine gun, one burning tank destroyer that should have exploded at any moment, against 6 tanks and 250 soldiers who should have overwhelmed him in minutes. The Germans who survived the assault never forgot the day they ran into the little American officer who wouldn't die. In post-war interviews, some of them spoke about it with a kind of bewildered respect. They'd done everything right tactically. Overwhelming force, combined arms, good weather for an assault. And they'd been stopped by one man who was too stubborn or too brave or too crazy to recognize that he was supposed to lose. But Murphy himself never seemed to think of Holtzwihr as his finest moment. When reporters asked him about it, he deflected, talking instead about the men he'd served with, the ones who hadn't made it home. In his memoir, he wrote more about the friends he'd lost than the battles he'd won. The weight of survival guilt pressed on him harder than any medal ever could. There's a photograph of Murphy from shortly after the war, standing in his captain's uniform with the Medal of Honor around his neck, looking impossibly young and impossibly tired. His eyes are the eyes of someone who's seen too much, carried too much, survived too much. They're the eyes of a boy who went to war at 18 and came back at 21 having lived several lifetimes in between. What drove him to stand on that burning tank destroyer? That's the question historians and psychologists have debated for decades. Was it duty? Bride? A death wish disguised as courage? Or was it something simpler and more profound? The understanding that sometimes the only way to save the people you're responsible for is to put yourself between them and annihilation, regardless of the cost. Murphy never gave a clear answer, and maybe there wasn't one to give. Courage that extreme doesn't usually come with explanations. It comes from a place deeper than logic, from the part of human nature that can stare into certain death and say, not today. On January 26, 1945, Audie Murphy became a symbol of something America desperately needed to believe in, that ordinary people could do extraordinary things, that size didn't matter when measured against will, that one person standing in the right place at the right time could change the course of history. He was 19 years old, weighed barely 100 pounds, stood 5'5" in his boots, and held off an entire German assault with nothing but a machine gun and a telephone. He was supposed to die that day. The mathematics of warfare said he should have died a dozen times over. But he didn't. He stood his ground, called in artillery, killed enemy soldiers by the dozen, and when the ammunition ran out and his leg was bleeding and the battle was over, he climbed down from that burning tank destroyer and walked back to his lines. And in doing so, he proved something that every soldier who's ever worn a uniform instinctively knows but can rarely articulate, that the difference between victory and defeat, between living and dying, between breaking and holding, sometimes comes down to one person's refusal to quit. One person's decision that their life matters less than the mission. One person's willingness to stand on a burning tank in the middle of a frozen field and become the thing the enemy can't kill and can't ignore and can't defeat. Audie Murphy was that person. And for one impossible hour on a January afternoon in France, he was also something more. He was invincible. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. There are more untold stories of courage and sacrifice waiting to be shared. Drop a like if you think Audie Murphy's stand deserves to be remembered. And here's a question for you. What do you think drove Audie Murphy to stand alone when everyone else would have fallen back? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.